Hi everybody, this video goes over the week 2 vocabulary. The terms I'm going to be talking about are narrator, narrative point of view, and related to that are first person point of view, third person limited point of view, and third person omniscient point of view. And then finally, free and direct discourse. The narrator of a story is the person who is telling the story or the novel. Sometimes a narrator is a character within the story or the novel, and sometimes a narrator is a person outside of the story or the novel. However, it's important to recognize that the narrator is not the same as the author. To give the example of A Good Man is Hard to Find, which we're reading for this week, the narrator of that story is not necessarily the same person as Flannery O'Connor, who is the author of the story. Or to give another example, the narrator of Cathedral is not the same person as Raymond Carver, who's the author of the story. So even when a narrator has access to a character's internal thoughts and feelings, we shouldn't assume that a narrator is voicing an author's thoughts or opinions. So when we're talking about the person who is sort of speaking to us in the story, we should always refer to that person as the narrator and not as the author. Okay, the next term I'm going to talk about is narrative point of view. Narrative point of view, which is also sometimes called a narrative perspective, refers to the point of view that the narrative is told from. And the narrative point of view depends on who the narrator is and what kind of information the narrator has access to. And now I'm going to go over some different examples of different narrative points of view. So the first one I'll talk about is a first-person point of view. So a story or novel told from the first-person point of view is told by a character inside the story or the novel. And in this kind of narrative, the narrator doesn't know anything beyond what he or she has witnessed or experienced. So, for example, in the story Cathedral, which we're reading for this week, is told from the perspective of a sort of unnamed character who is within the story, right? He talks to people within the story, he interacts with people who are within the story. And because he's a person within the story, he can only describe events that he has seen or experienced, which limits the information that he can provide to us as readers. Another point of view is a third-person limited point of view. So a story or novel told from a third-person limited point of view is told to us by a narrator outside the story. So that's a third-person narrator, someone who's outside the story, and who only has access to a few characters' thoughts. So that's the limited part of this. This narrator has access to a limited information and to a limited number of characters' thoughts and feelings. To give an example, Summer, which we read last week, is told from a third-person limited point of view. The narrator is not a character within the story, so the narrator isn't someone who's interacting with the characters within the story. So it's a third-person narrator. However, the narrator only reveals what one character is thinking and feeling, and that's the character of Homer. And then the final point of view that I'll talk about is a third-person omniscient point of view. So a story or a novel told from a third-person omniscient point of view is also told by a narrator outside the story. So this is, again, a third-person narrator, someone who's outside the story. But this narrator has access to all of the characters' thoughts, which is why we use the term omniscient, because this person knows what every character is sort of thinking and feeling, and also sort of conveys that to the reader. And an example of this that's famous and that you may have read is the novel The Scarlet Letter. That's a novel that is told from a third-person omniscient point of view. So the narrator is not a character within the novel, it's a third-person narrator, and the narrator reveals what multiple characters are thinking and feeling at different times. So sometimes the narrator tells us what Hester Prynne is thinking and feeling. Sometimes the narrator tells us what Arthur Dimmesdale is thinking or feeling. Sometimes the narrator tells us what other characters are thinking and feeling as well. So the third-person narrator isn't limited to one character or to a few characters in the same way that a third-person limited narrator is. And then the final term I'm going to talk about is free and direct discourse. And this is a little bit more complicated than narrative perspective. This is a technique that writers use, that writers use in order to give us as readers access to a character's thoughts. So, as I say here, it's a special kind of third-person narration in which the narrator seamlessly slips into the mind of a character, giving reader access to the character's thought process. So I have an example here, which is from Story of an Hour, which we read for last week. In this example, the word choice and imagery of the passage reflect Mrs. Mallard's perspective. So the narrator says, "She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her face, fixed in gray and dead." So in this passage, she's remembering sort of her husband when he was alive, remembering especially his kind, tender hands, and those seem to be sort of her words and her way of thinking about him. So this isn't necessarily the narrator's perspective, this is Mrs. Mallard's perspective. And then she also is, imagining his face when he's a corpse as fixed in gray and dead. And again, that word choice and that imagery is reflecting sort of her unique perspective. She's not the one who's speaking. She's not saying, "I'm remembering his tender hands and I'm imagining his cold, dead, gray face." So she's not speaking, the narrator is speaking, but the narrator is still, the narrator's word choice and imagery is reflecting her thoughts and reflecting her feelings. So you have sort of the third-person narrator and the character's perspective sort of become merged in this sort of interesting sort of moment in the story. So that's an example of free indirect discourse. And it's important in Story of an Hour, and it also pops up a little bit in some of the other stories that we'll be talking about this week. So that's the end of this lecture. If you have any questions about any of these terms, feel free to post to the Ask My Instructor discussion forum or send me an email.